Hi, I'm Sarah Mitchell. 2 weeks ago, I found my 6-month-old daughter Emma having violent seizures in her nursery after drinking formula that my mother-in-law Patricia had insisted on preparing herself. While I was screaming for the paramedics, she stood calmly in the hallway, arms crossed, and said with this chilling satisfaction, "Maybe now you'll understand that some people just aren't meant to be mothers." What she didn't know was that my father wasn't just any concerned grandfather. He was four-star General Robert Mitchell, commanding the entire Eastern Seaboard's defense operations, and when that emergency call reached him during a classified Pentagon briefing, the room went dead silent. What happened next didn't just end her reign of terror, it exposed a pharmaceutical conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military contractor fraud. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she never understood was that attacking a four-star general's granddaughter wasn't just assault, it was a direct threat to national security personnel, and by dawn the next morning, Patricia was facing federal agents who'd been tracking her activities for months. Keep watching, because the phone call that changed everything happened at exactly 2:47 in the morning, and by sunrise my mother-in-law was begging for a plea deal that would never come. The December wind in North Carolina carries a particular bite when you're pacing the floors at 3 in the morning, holding your baby daughter while she fights through another restless night. Emma had been struggling for nearly 2 weeks, rejecting bottles that she'd eagerly taken just days before, crying with a desperation that seemed to pierce straight through my exhausted heart. I'd called Dr. Gonzalez 3 times in the past week, but she kept reassuring me that growth spurts were normal, that some babies went through difficult phases, especially when their fathers were deployed overseas. Nothing to panic about, she'd said. First-time mother anxiety, she'd suggested. I should have trusted the instincts that had been screaming danger for days. Our house in Pine Valley Estates felt enormous with Jake deployed for another 8 months. Every settling creak in the walls, every whisper of wind through the pine trees that gave our neighborhood its name seemed amplified in the profound silence that comes when you're the only adult responsible for keeping a tiny human alive. We'd chosen this particular house specifically because of its proximity to Fort Bragg, where the 82nd Airborne Community understood the unique challenges of military families. The neighbors were predominantly other Army wives who'd walked this same lonely path during their own husbands' deployments. Mrs. Chen from next door had been especially wonderful since Emma's birth, often appearing with homemade casseroles or offering to watch Emma while I grabbed a quick shower. She'd survived 6 deployments with her husband before his retirement, and she had this intuitive way of knowing exactly when I needed support without making me feel like a charity case. Sometimes I'd find fresh flowers from her garden on my doorstep, or she'd text offering to pick up groceries when she was heading to the commissary. It was the kind of genuine community support that made the endless solo parenting bearable, the knowledge that I wasn't completely alone even when Jake was literally on the other side of the world. But family, I'd discovered, could inflict wounds that no stranger would ever dare attempt. Patricia Thompson had arrived unannounced that frigid Tuesday morning, her pristine white Mercedes pulling into my driveway just as I was attempting to coax Emma into taking her morning bottle. She emerged from the car wearing what I'd come to recognize as her uniform of dominance, a tailored black coat that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, designer boots that clicked against the pavement with military precision, and that practiced smile she'd perfected during her years as a pharmaceutical sales executive. My mother-in-law had always been stunning in that effortless way that made other women feel invisible by comparison. Even at 58, she commanded attention wherever she went, with silver hair that fell in perfect waves and the kind of bone structure that photographs beautifully. During Jake's childhood, she'd been the mother who volunteered for every school committee, who threw elaborate birthday parties that other families used as benchmarks, who made sure her son understood that excellence wasn't optional in the Thompson family. I'd always felt like an inadequate replacement for the socialite daughters-in-law she'd probably envisioned for her successful son. While she'd climbed corporate ladders and collected prestigious awards, I'd worked my way through nursing school with night shifts and student loans. Where she'd married for status and built a life around appearances, I'd chosen Jake for love and built our relationship around shared values and genuine partnership. The contrast had never felt more pronounced than it did that morning, standing in my doorway wearing yesterday's pajamas with spit-up stains on my shoulder, while she looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful professional women. "You look absolutely dreadful," she announced, brushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. Her perfume, something expensive and overpowering, seemed to fill every corner of my modest living room. When's the last time you've had a proper meal or decent night's sleep? This can't be healthy for the baby. I closed the door behind her, already feeling that familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Patricia had this remarkable talent for making observations that sounded like maternal concern but felt like calculated attacks on my competence as both a wife and mother. It's been a challenging couple of weeks, I said, settling Emma in her bouncer near the window where the winter sunlight caught her fine auburn hair. She's been fussy lately, and with Jake's
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Communication schedule being so limited, I'm managing everything solo right now. Emma had inherited Jake's striking blue eyes and my stubborn chin, and even at 6 months there was something remarkably alert and intelligent in her gaze that reminded me so much of my father. She was developing beautifully, meeting every milestone ahead of schedule, but Patricia had never shown much interest in celebrating her granddaughter's achievements. Still no direct contact from my son, Patricia said, settling onto my couch with the territorial confidence of someone claiming space that belonged to them. I find it quite convenient how these military communications are always so mysteriously limited whenever there are responsibilities to handle at home. The comment hit exactly where she'd intended it to land. Jake wasn't avoiding responsibility or making excuses. He was serving his country in a combat zone where operational security meant that personal communications were necessarily restricted. But explaining military protocol to Patricia was like trying to describe color to someone who insisted the world existed only in black and white. He calls when operational security allows, I said quietly, picking up some of Emma's toys from the carpet. The nature of his current assignment means communications are limited for everyone's safety. How terribly convenient, she repeated, examining her perfectly manicured nails with theatrical disinterest. Meanwhile, you're here drowning in responsibilities you're clearly not equipped to handle. That baby looks thin, Sarah. When's the last time she had a proper medical evaluation? I wanted to defend myself, to list all the ways I was successfully managing our household, maintaining Emma's health, keeping everything functioning despite the challenges of solo parenting. But something in Patricia's tone made me pause. There was an edge there that I hadn't heard before, something sharper and more dangerous than her usual passive-aggressive commentary. Dr. Gonzalez saw her last week, I said. Emma's weight and development are perfectly normal. She's just going through a fussy phase that a lot of babies experience. Doctors miss things, Patricia said, standing and walking over to where Emma was playing. Especially when mothers aren't providing accurate information about what's really happening at home. She looked down at my daughter with an expression that I couldn't quite interpret. Babies are so vulnerable, so completely dependent on their caregivers making the right decisions. One mistake, one moment of poor judgment, and everything can change. Something cold settled in my chest at the way she said it. This wasn't general commentary about parenting challenges. This felt specific, targeted, like she was delivering a warning about something she knew was coming. What are you trying to say, Patricia? I asked, moving closer to Emma's bouncer. I'm saying that perhaps you need more support than you're currently receiving, she replied, turning back to me with that calculated smile. I've been thinking about your situation quite a lot lately. How isolated you are here, how overwhelmed you seem, how much pressure you're under trying to manage everything alone. She walked back to her purse and pulled out a small shopping bag with the logo of a high-end pharmacy, which is why I brought you something that might help. New infant formula supplements that my company has been developing specifically for fussy babies with feeding difficulties. I stared at the bag without reaching for it. I don't want to give Emma anything that hasn't been approved by her pediatrician. These are completely natural, Patricia said, her voice shifting into the professional tone she'd perfected during decades of pharmaceutical sales. Probiotics and digestive enzymes designed to help with the exact issues you've been describing. I've been working with the development team for months, and the preliminary results have been remarkable. She pulled out 3 small containers, each labeled with official-looking pharmaceutical stickers and ingredient lists. One packet mixed into her regular formula should resolve the feeding issues within hours. You might actually get some sleep for once. Every instinct I possessed was screaming not to accept whatever she'd brought into my house. I'd really prefer to discuss any supplements with Dr. Gonzalez first. Of course, Patricia said, but her tone suggested that my caution was yet another example of my inadequacy as a mother. Though I'm not sure how much longer you can afford to wait. Babies who develop feeding aversions during this critical developmental window often struggle with nutrition and growth for years. You could be creating problems that affect Emma for her entire childhood. She gathered her coat and purse, preparing to leave. But if you'd rather watch your daughter suffer because you're too stubborn to accept help from someone with actual expertise in infant nutrition, that's certainly your choice. The manipulation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. She was presenting my maternal caution as selfishness, my desire to consult with Emma's doctor as stubborn pride that would ultimately harm my child. If I hadn't been so exhausted, so worn down by weeks of difficult nights and worried days, I might have seen through the technique immediately. "I'll think about it," I said, though every fiber of my being was rejecting whatever she'd brought. "Don't think too long," she replied, kissing my cheek with lips that felt cold against my skin. Babies Emma's age can't afford to wait when they're struggling with proper nutrition. After she left, I stood in my foyer for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of my house settling around me. Emma had fallen asleep in her bouncer, her tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm that had become my favorite sound in the world. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows should have felt warm and comforting, but somehow the air felt different, charged with an undercurrent of threat that I couldn't quite identify. I walked over to the coffee table and examined the containers Patricia had left behind. They looked professionally manufactured, complete with batch numbers, expiration dates, and detailed ingredient lists printed in small font. Most of the components were vitamins and minerals that I recognized from my nursing training, but there were several compounds listed that I'd never heard of, long chemical names that could have meant anything. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped with hope that it might be Jake, but it was just Mrs. Chen asking if I needed anything from her commissary run. I typed back a quick thank you but declined, then stared at my phone screen showing Jake's last message from 4 days ago. "Missing my girls terribly. Tell Emma her daddy loves her and thinks about her every single day. Home soon, I promise." Home soon. He'd been saying that for 3 months now, and I understood why operational timelines couldn't be shared for security reasons. But the loneliness was becoming physically painful, and Patricia's visit had somehow made it worse. She'd managed to highlight every insecurity I'd been battling, every moment of self-doubt that crept in during the long nights when Emma wouldn't settle and I questioned every decision I made. I picked up one of the formula containers again, and read through the ingredient list more carefully. Everything appeared to be standard nutritional supplements, the kind of probiotics and enzymes that were commonly used to help babies with digestive issues. But something about the way Patricia had presented them bothered me. The urgency she'd created, the professional pressure combined with personal guilt, the suggestion that Emma's health problems were more serious than her pediatrician had indicated. Emma woke up crying, and I lifted her from the bouncer, feeling her settle immediately against my chest with that instinctive trust that babies have for their mothers. She was warm and solid and perfect, her development progressing normally, despite the recent fussiness. Gonzalez had been clear that Emma was thriving, that the feeding difficulties were well within normal ranges for a 6-month-old. So why was I even considering using whatever Patricia had brought? Because I was exhausted, I realized. Not just physically, though the sleep deprivation was real enough, but emotionally drained from carrying the full weight of parenthood alone. I was tired of making every decision without backup, of second-guessing myself constantly because there was no one else there to reassure me that I was handling things correctly. But that didn't mean I should trust Patricia with my daughter's health. My mother-in-law had never shown genuine interest in Emma's well-being before today. She'd visited exactly once since Emma was born, stayed for less than an hour, and spent most of that time criticizing my housekeeping and suggesting that I wasn't recovering from childbirth quickly enough. She'd never asked about Emma's milestones, never remembered important dates, never even sent a card when Emma had her first Christmas. Now suddenly she was concerned about Emma's nutrition. Now she happened to have access to experimental supplements that would solve all our problems. I carried Emma to the kitchen and stood there holding her while I stared at the containers on the counter. The rational part of my brain was telling me to throw them away, to trust my instincts and my pediatrician's expertise. But another part of me, the part that was worn down by weeks of difficult nights and constant worry, wondered what if Patricia was right? What if Emma really was struggling more than normal? What if I was letting my complicated feelings about my mother-in-law prevent me from helping my daughter? Emma started crying again, not her usual hungry cry or tired cry, but something that sounded almost distressed, like her stomach was cramping. I tried the usual comfort measures, bouncing, shushing, offering a pacifier, but nothing seemed to help. Her little face scrunched up in what looked like genuine pain, and suddenly all my nursing training was screaming that something was wrong. I called Dr. Gonzalez's after-hours line and waited through the automated menu while Emma continued crying in my arms. When the answering service finally picked up, I explained the situation as calmly as I could, but I could hear the worry creeping into my voice, despite my efforts to stay professional. "The doctor will call you back within the hour," the receptionist said. "If this is a true emergency, please hang up and call 911. I hung up and looked at Emma, whose crying had settled into exhausted whimpering that somehow broke my heart even more than the screaming. Was this an emergency? She wasn't running a fever, wasn't showing signs of serious illness, just seemed to be experiencing digestive discomfort that was more intense than usual. The internal battle lasted another 30 minutes, with Emma crying intermittently and me growing more desperate by the minute. When Dr. Gonzalez finally called back, she listened to my description and asked all the appropriate questions about temperature, feeding schedule, and elimination patterns. Everything sounded normal to her experienced ear. "It could be a mild stomach bug," she said, "or just a particularly difficult growth spurt. Babies go through phases where they're more sensitive to normal digestive processes. Try some gentle tummy massage, maybe bicycle her legs to help with gas. If she's still inconsolable in the morning, bring her in for an examination." After we hung up, I tried her suggestions, but Emma was still clearly uncomfortable. I was running on about 4 hours of sleep from the night before, and my judgment was starting to get cloudy from the combination of exhaustion and maternal anxiety. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I prepared Emma's evening bottle with her usual formula, then stood staring at the containers on the counter for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I opened one of them and mixed in a small amount, less than half the recommended dose, just to be safe. If it really was just probiotics and digestive enzymes like Patricia had claimed, it shouldn't cause any problems. And if it helped Emma feel better, maybe we could both get some desperately needed rest. I tested the temperature carefully, shook the bottle thoroughly to mix everything together, and offered it to Emma. She latched on immediately, drinking with the kind of eager hunger that suggested she really had been feeling unwell. Within minutes, she'd finished the entire bottle and was looking more relaxed than she had in days. I burped her gently, changed her diaper, and rocked her to sleep in the nursery chair by the window where we'd spent so many peaceful evenings together. For the first time in weeks, she settled quickly into the deep, even breathing of truly restful sleep. Maybe Patricia had been right after all. Maybe I had been too suspicious, too quick to dismiss help when it was offered with genuine intention. I put Emma in her crib and stood there for a moment, watching her sleep so peacefully. She looked perfect, content, completely safe in her familiar surroundings. The tight knot of worry that had been living in my chest for the past week finally started to loosen. I was halfway down the hallway toward my own bedroom when I heard the first sound that made my blood turn to ice. Not crying. Emma rarely cried once she was truly settled for the night. This was something else entirely, a strange gasping sound, like she was struggling to breathe properly. I ran back to her room and found her convulsing in her crib, her small body rigid with seizure activity. Her eyes had rolled back so only the whites were showing, foam was coming from her mouth, and her lips were starting to turn blue. Oh God, Emma. I scooped her up, her body, burning hot and trembling violently against my chest. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and when I called her name, she didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me through whatever was attacking her nervous system. I ran for the phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers, while trying to keep Emma upright and breathing. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, asking questions I could barely process through my terror. "My baby is having seizures," I managed to say. "She's 6 months old. She was fine an hour ago, and now she's convulsing and her breathing is wrong." "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm," the dispatcher said. "An ambulance is on the way. Is the baby breathing?" I checked my nursing training automatically kicking in despite my panic. "Yes, but it's shallow and there's foam coming from her mouth." "Okay, I need you to make sure her airway stays clear. Turn her on her side if you can, but don't put anything in her mouth. Don't try to restrain the seizure movements, just keep her safe and keep talking to me." The next 12 minutes were the longest of my life. I followed the dispatcher's instructions while Emma's little body fought against whatever poison was attacking her system. The paramedics arrived with sirens wailing, filling my quiet house with urgent voices and emergency equipment that looked enormous compared to my tiny daughter. They worked on her right there on my living room floor, starting an IV with needles so small I could barely see it, checking her vital signs with equipment designed for adult patients, but scaled down for pediatric emergencies. They asked rapid-fire questions about her medical history, what she'd eaten, any new medications or exposures. "Any new medications or supplements?" one of the paramedics asked, his voice sharp with professional urgency. "Anything different in her routine today?" That's when I remembered the formula supplement, the container still sitting on my kitchen counter with Patricia's reassuring words echoing in my memory. There was something I said, my voice barely a whisper. My mother-in-law brought some formula supplements. I gave her one dose mixed into her evening bottle. The lead paramedic's expression changed immediately, becoming more focused and grim. "Do you still have the containers?" I nodded, running to the kitchen and grabbing all 3 containers plus the partially mixed bottle. When I handed them over, I saw something pass between the 2 paramedics, a look that made my blood run even colder than it already was. "We need to get her to Cape Fear Valley immediately," the senior paramedic said. "This looks like acute poisoning. Time is critical." Poisoning. The word hit me like a physical blow. I watched them load my unconscious daughter into the ambulance, her small body dwarfed by adult-sized medical equipment, and felt my entire world shift off its axis. Patricia had poisoned my baby. My own mother-in-law had looked me in the eye, handed me something she claimed would help Emma, and watched me give it to my daughter knowing it would cause exactly this kind of medical crisis. She had stood in my living room, touched Emma's face, called her vulnerable, and then provided me with the means to harm her. The ride to Cape Fear Valley Medical Center passed in a blur of sirens and medical terminology that I recognized from my nursing background, but had never imagined hearing applied to my own child. Emma remained unconscious throughout the transport, her breathing supported by a pediatric oxygen mask that covered most of her tiny face. I held her hand through the maze of IV lines and monitoring wires, whispering promises I wasn't certain I could keep about everything being okay, about mommy fixing this, about daddy coming home soon. The emergency department at Cape Fear Valley was a controlled chaos of medical professionals who moved with the practiced efficiency that comes from years of handling pediatric crises. They rushed Emma into a treatment bay, while I stood helplessly in the corridor, watching through glass doors as a team of doctors and nurses worked to stabilize her condition. A nurse brought me paperwork, asking about insurance information and emergency contacts, questions about medical history that seemed impossibly mundane given the circumstances. Under emergency contact, I automatically wrote Jake's name and his deployed unit information, even though I knew standard military communication channels would be useless in this situation. But then I remembered something my father had told me during our last conversation when Emma was born. He'd seemed more serious than usual, speaking in that careful tone he used when discussing matters that touched on his military responsibilities. "Sarah, if anything ever happens, anything at all that requires immediate action, you call my direct emergency line," he'd said, programming a number into my phone that bypassed all normal Pentagon protocols. "This number reaches me regardless of where I am, what meeting I'm in, or what time zone I'm operating in. It's for absolute emergencies only, but if you need me, really need me, this will get through." I'd laughed at the time, asking what kind of emergency could possibly require a 4-star general's immediate intervention. Dad had just smiled and said, "Hopefully nothing, sweetheart, but if something does happen, you'll know exactly what to do." Now I understood what he'd meant. I found the number in my phone's emergency contacts and called from the hospital corridor. It rang exactly once before a crisp military voice answered, "General Mitchell's emergency line. State your name and the nature of your emergency." "This is Sarah Mitchell, General Mitchell's daughter. I need to reach my father immediately. It's a family emergency involving my infant daughter." There was a brief pause, then the voice became more formal. "Ma'am, I'll need you to verify your identity with the General's family authentication code." My father's authentication code. He'd made me memorize it 6 months ago, said it was standard security protocol for family members of senior military officials. I'd never imagined I'd actually need to use it. "Delta 77 Romeo," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, the tone had changed completely. "Mrs. Thompson, what's the nature of your emergency?" "Someone poisoned my baby. She's in critical condition at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center. I need my father to know what's happened." "Ma'am, I'm going to put you on a secure hold while I initiate emergency contact protocols. This may take several minutes, but General Mitchell will be reached wherever he is. Can you remain on this line?" "Yes," I whispered, sinking into a plastic chair in the hospital corridor. "I'll wait." 18 minutes later, my father's voice came through the phone, slightly distorted by whatever secure communication system had been used to reach him, but unmistakably his calm, commanding presence that had been my anchor throughout childhood. "Sarah, sweetheart, what's happened?" The sound of his voice broke through the emotional dam I'd been maintaining since finding Emma convulsing in her crib. I told him everything about Patricia's visit, about the formula supplements she'd insisted would help, about finding Emma having seizures after drinking the bottle I'd prepared. I described the paramedics' immediate assessment of poisoning, the emergency transport, the medical team that was still working to stabilize Emma's condition. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought we might have lost connection. When my father finally spoke, his voice had transformed into something I'd only heard a few times in my life, during family emergencies, when his military training took complete control. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you somewhere private where we can speak freely?" I looked around the hospital corridor, where a few other families were dealing with their own medical crises, but no one was paying attention to my conversation. "Yes, Dad. First, I want you to know that Emma is going to be okay. We're going to make absolutely certain of that. Second, I need you to preserve those formula
containers and any remaining powder as evidence. Don't let anyone handle them except the medical staff treating Emma. They're evidence now and we're going to need them." "Evidence for what?" I asked, though part of me already understood what he was telling me. "For the criminal investigation that's about to begin," he said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that came from decades of military command. "Patricia Thompson made a catastrophic error tonight, Sarah. She attacked the granddaughter of a 4-star general, and she's about to discover what happens when you threaten the family of someone with access to unlimited federal resources." The line went quiet for a moment while he spoke to someone else, his voice muffled but urgent. Then he was back, speaking directly to me with the kind of focused intensity that I remembered from childhood when he was solving complex problems. "I'm initiating emergency protocols that will have federal investigators in North Carolina within hours. This isn't just assault or attempted murder anymore, Sarah. This is a potential attack on the family of senior military leadership, which makes it a matter of national security." "Dad, what are you going to do?" "I'm coming home," he said simply. "But before I leave Washington, there are calls I need to make, resources I need to mobilize." Patricia Thompson thinks she's dealing with an isolated military wife whose husband is conveniently deployed overseas. She has no idea that she just declared war on someone who commands the entire Eastern Defense Command. His voice softened slightly, becoming more recognizably the father who'd read me bedtime stories and taught me how to ride a bicycle. "Take care of our baby girl, sweetheart. I'll be there as soon as I can arrange transport." "And Sarah?" "Yes, Dad, this ends tonight." After we hung up, I sat in that hospital chair staring at my phone while the reality of what was about to unfold began to sink in. Emma was fighting for her life behind glass doors, connected to machines that I recognized from my nursing education but had never imagined seeing attached to my own child. Patricia was probably at home, maybe having dinner or watching television, completely unaware that her carefully planned cruelty had just triggered something far beyond her imagination. She thought she was dealing with a vulnerable young mother, isolated and overwhelmed while her husband was deployed in a combat zone. She had no idea that my father wasn't just any concerned grandfather. She didn't know about his security clearance, his position in the Pentagon's chain of command, or the resources he could bring to bear when his family was threatened. But she was about to find out, because in less than 6 hours, when Dad's emergency transport landed at Pope Army Airfield, Patricia Thompson's world was going to change forever. Dr. Amanda Foster, the pediatric toxicologist who'd taken over Emma's care, emerged from the treatment room with news that made my knees weak with relief. They'd identified the compound that caused Emma's seizures, a synthetic stimulant that had no legitimate medical use and definitely didn't belong in infant formula. It was designed to cause neurological damage in developing brains, potentially fatal in the dosage Patricia had recommended. "We're going to continue monitoring her for the next 48 hours, Dr. Foster explained, her voice gentle but serious. "The positive news is that you brought her in quickly, and we were able to begin treatment before the toxin could cause permanent damage. Children her age have remarkable resilience, but we want to ensure there are no lasting neurological effects." I was allowed into Emma's room, where she lay sleeping peacefully in a pediatric hospital bed surrounded by monitoring equipment but breathing on her own. Her color had returned to normal, and the terrifying rigidity that had marked her seizures was completely gone. She looked so small in that hospital bed, but also remarkably strong, like she was fighting her way back to health with the same determination that ran through our family's military bloodline. The morning after Emma's poisoning, I woke up in a hospital chair to find my father standing in the doorway, still wearing his dress uniform from whatever Pentagon meeting he'd left to get here. He looked older than I remembered, the stress of the past 12 hours etched in the lines around his eyes, but there was something else there too, something cold and absolutely determined, that reminded me why he'd risen to the highest levels of military command. Dad looked at Emma first, his expression softening as he took in her peaceful sleeping form and the steady rhythm of her breathing. Then he looked at me, and I saw my own fury reflected back in his eyes, multiplied by the protective instincts of both a grandfather and a career military officer who'd spent decades neutralizing threats to American families. "How is she?" he asked quietly, his voice controlled but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Better. The doctors think she'll make a complete recovery. They've identified the toxin and neutralized most of it." I stood up from the chair, my legs unsteady from sitting in one position too long. "Dad, she planned this. This wasn't some accident or moment of poor judgment. Patricia deliberately tried to kill Emma." He crossed the room and pulled me into the kind of embrace that had made everything better throughout my childhood, his arms wrapping around me with the strength that comes from someone who's spent a career protecting people he cares about. I breathed in the familiar scent of his aftershave and felt some of the terror I'd been carrying finally start to release. "I know," he murmured against my hair. "I know exactly what she did, and I know exactly what I'm going to do about it." We stood there for a moment, holding each other while Emma slept peacefully a few feet away, completely unaware that her survival had set in motion events that would expose a criminal network spanning multiple states. Then Dad pulled back and looked at me with an expression I'd seen before when he was briefing subordinates on operations that couldn't fail. "Sarah, I need you to tell me everything. Every detail you can remember about Patricia's visit, about what she said and how she said it. Don't leave anything out, regardless of how insignificant it might seem." I walked him through the entire encounter, from the moment Patricia appeared at my door to the moment I found Emma convulsing in her crib. Dad listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively more grim with each detail. When I described Patricia touching Emma's face and commenting about how vulnerable babies were, something flickered across his expression that made me grateful I wasn't on the receiving end of his anger. "She brought 3 containers, I said, pointing to the evidence bag that hospital security had collected. "I only used one, and only about half the recommended dose." "If you'd given Emma the full amount she suggested," Dad said quietly, "we'd be planning a funeral instead of her recovery." He took my hand, his thumb tracing across my knuckles in the comforting gesture he'd used since I was small. "But you didn't. You followed your nursing instincts and used less than she recommended. That caution probably saved Emma's life." Before I could respond, there was a knock on the door, and a woman in a dark business suit appeared with federal credentials and the kind of alertness that suggested she'd been awake for more than 24 hours. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional style and eyes that missed nothing. "General Mitchell," she said, nodding respectfully. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Martinez with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but I want you to know that threats against senior military families receive our highest priority." She pulled up a chair and opened a tablet that displayed what looked like a comprehensive dossier on Patricia. "In the past 18 hours, we've assembled a complete profile on Patricia Thompson, including her employment records, financial transactions, personal communications, and travel history. What we've discovered is extremely troubling." The screen filled with documents, bank statements, employment records, email threads, and phone logs. It was like seeing Patricia's entire life dissected and analyzed by federal investigators with unlimited resources. "First, the compound she used to poison your daughter," Agent Martinez said, swiping to display chemical analysis reports. "We've identified it as compound XK9, a synthetic neurotoxin that's not approved for any legitimate medical use. It's currently being researched as a potential chemical weapon, and it's extremely difficult to obtain through legal channels." She showed us financial records displaying a series of cryptocurrency transactions. 4 months ago, Patricia made contact with someone using the identity Dr. Chen through encrypted messaging applications. She paid him $12,000 in cryptocurrency for what she described as research materials for pharmaceutical development. $12,000. 4 months of planning. Patricia had spent more money trying to murder my daughter than most families spent on a car, and she'd been planning it since before Emma was even sitting up on her own. Dr. Chen doesn't exist, of course. Agent Martinez continued. The cryptocurrency payments were traced to a network that specializes in providing untraceable toxins to individuals who want to commit murder without detection. We're talking about a sophisticated criminal organization that supplies weapons to domestic abusers, hired killers, and people involved in organized crime. Dad leaned forward, his expression intensely focused. You're saying Patricia was connected to professional criminals? More than connected, Agent Martinez replied, swiping to display another screen of evidence. She was actively involved in their research and development process. The detailed records she kept about Emma's condition, her analysis of dosage effects, her documentation of detection methods, all of that information was being fed back to the criminal network to help them refine their products. The room went completely silent as the implications settled over us. Patricia hadn't just tried to murder Emma to satisfy some twisted psychological need. She'd been using my daughter as a test subject for a criminal organization that supplied murder weapons to killers around the world. How many others? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Agent Martinez's expression became even more serious. We're still investigating, but we've identified at least 6 other cases over the past 3 years, where children died under circumstances similar to what happened to Emma. All of them had some connection to Patricia Thompson, and all of them involved mothers who were isolated, overwhelmed, and vulnerable to offers of help from someone with pharmaceutical credentials. She pulled up photographs of families, smiling parents holding babies who would never grow up because Patricia had decided they were suitable test subjects for her poison research. Patricia specifically targeted military wives whose husbands were deployed, single mothers without family support, women who were struggling with postpartum depression or other challenges that made them grateful for professional assistance. Dad stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the North Carolina landscape with the expression he wore when processing complex strategic information. What you're describing isn't just serial murder. It's systematic research using American families as unwilling test subjects. Exactly, Agent Martinez confirmed. And because of your daughter's survival and your family's resources, we now have access to the entire criminal network. In the past 12 hours, we've initiated operations in 7 states and 3 countries. By the end of this week, we'll have dismantled an organization that's been operating undetected for over a decade. She closed the tablet and looked at both of us seriously. But there's something else you need to understand. The people Patricia was working with don't appreciate it when their associates get arrested and their operations get exposed. Your family is going to remain under federal protection until we're confident that everyone involved in this network has been neutralized. Emma stirred in her hospital bed, making the soft sounds that meant she was waking up from her medicated sleep. I went to her bedside and watched as her eyes opened, focusing on my face with the kind of recognition that made my heart soar. She was going to be okay. Whatever poison Patricia had given her, whatever damage it might have caused, Emma was fighting her way back to health, with the resilience that seemed to be encoded in her DNA. Hey there, baby girl, I whispered, stroking her fine hair. Mommy's here and Grandpa came to see you. Dad approached the bed carefully, his stern expression melting into the gentle smile he reserved for his granddaughter. Hello, princess. You gave us quite a scare, but you're tougher than the bad people thought you were. Agent Martinez gathered her materials and prepared to leave. We'll be in touch with regular updates as the investigation progresses. General Mitchell, we'll coordinate through your security detail for any additional briefings. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that your family's cooperation has probably prevented dozens of other families from experiencing what you've been through. After she left, Dad and I sat quietly beside Emma's bed, watching her gradually become more alert and responsive. The monitors showed all her vital signs returning to normal, and Dr. Foster had indicated that we might be able to take her home later that day, if her recovery continued at the current pace. There's something I need to tell you about what's going to happen next, Dad said, his voice taking on the tone he used when discussing matters that touched on classified operations. Patricia Thompson isn't just going to be arrested by local police and charged in state court. This is now a federal case involving national security, terrorism, and international criminal conspiracy. He looked at Emma, who was beginning to show interest in the colorful mobile hanging above her bed. When we're done with Patricia and her associates, they'll be facing federal charges that carry life sentences without the possibility of parole. This isn't just about justice for Emma anymore. It's about protecting every American family from the kind of evil that Patricia represents. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I was surprised to see Jake's name on the screen. Somehow, the military's emergency communication system had reached him in his deployed location, and he was being granted emergency leave to return home. Emergency transport arranged, the message read. Coming home to my girls. Hold on, I showed the message to Dad, who smiled with the satisfaction of someone who just accomplished something complex and difficult. I pulled some strings to get him home. Family emergencies take priority over operational schedules, and a 4-star general's recommendation carries considerable weight with deployment commanders. Emma made a sound that might have been her first attempt at laughing, reaching up with tiny fingers toward the mobile above her bed. She was going to be okay. Jake was coming home. Patricia was about to face the full consequences of her actions. And somewhere in federal offices across the country, investigators were working to ensure that no other family would suffer what we'd been through. For the first time since finding Emma convulsing in her crib, I allowed myself to believe that this nightmare might actually be over. But as Agent Martinez had warned, people involved in criminal conspiracies don't simply surrender when their associates get arrested. They fight back, and they often target the families who helped expose them. Our quiet life in Pine Valley Estates was about to become something very different, surrounded by federal protection and constant vigilance against people who had nothing left to lose. Patricia had made the mistake of attacking a 4-star general's granddaughter. Now she was about to discover that some fights are too big to win, and some enemies are too powerful to defeat. The battle lines had been drawn, and my father had resources that she couldn't even imagine. The war Patricia had started was about to end in her complete destruction. 2 days after Emma's release from Cape Fear Valley Medical Center, I was feeding her morning bottle when Agent Martinez called with information that made my hands tremble so violently I nearly dropped the phone. They'd uncovered evidence linking Patricia to 11 additional cases spanning 6 states, all involving infant deaths that had been classified as sudden infant death syndrome, or unexplained medical complications. 11 families who'd buried their babies, believing they'd died of natural causes, never knowing they'd been murdered by a woman who documented their deaths like laboratory experiments. "We need you at the federal building in Raleigh this afternoon," Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of discoveries that kept expanding beyond anything we'd initially imagined. "There are families who want to meet you, families whose children died because of Patricia Thompson's criminal activities. And there are aspects of this investigation that go much deeper than we first realized." Dad was already dressed in his service uniform, the one with 4 stars that commanded immediate respect everywhere he went. He'd extended his emergency leave indefinitely, making it clear to his Pentagon staff that family security took precedence over all other responsibilities until this situation was completely resolved. "I'm coming with you," he said, helping me gather Emma's diaper bag and car seat. "This investigation involves national security implications that require my direct oversight." The drive to Raleigh was quiet, except for Emma's occasional babbling from her car seat, blissfully unaware that her survival had exposed a criminal network responsible for the deaths of children across multiple states. The federal building was an imposing structure of gray granite and reinforced glass, designed to remind visitors that the full power of federal law enforcement operated within its walls. Agent Martinez met us at the security checkpoint, her expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Before we go upstairs," she said, leading us to a small conference room, "I need to prepare you for what you're going to hear today. The investigation has revealed connections that are going to be extremely difficult to process." She opened a thick file, containing photographs and documents that immediately made my stomach turn. The first image showed Patricia at a pharmaceutical conference in Atlanta, wearing professional attire, and standing next to a display about infant nutrition research. She looked completely normal, like any other healthcare professional attending an industry event. "This was taken 14 months ago," Agent Martinez explained. Patricia was presenting research on pediatric feeding disorders to an audience of physicians and pharmaceutical researchers. What she was actually doing was testing market receptivity for products designed to harm children. I stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the woman I'd known as Jake's difficult but seemingly harmless mother with someone who'd been publicly promoting ways to hurt babies. How is that possible? How could she present that kind of research at a legitimate medical conference? Because she framed it as safety research, Agent Martinez replied, pulling out additional documents. She claimed to be studying how various compounds might accidentally contaminate infant formula, ostensibly to help manufacturers improve their safety protocols. In reality, she was gathering intelligence about which toxins would be most effective and least detectable. Dad leaned forward, his expression darkening as he processed the implications. "You're telling us she was conducting market research for a murder-for-hire operation, essentially, yes?" The criminal network she was working with needed to understand which products would be most effective for their clients, and Patricia provided that research by using real children as test subjects. Agent Martinez spread out more photographs, showing Patricia at various medical facilities across the Southeast. She volunteered at neonatal units in 7 different hospitals, always targeting facilities that served military families or other vulnerable populations. The systematic nature of Patricia's crimes was staggering. She hadn't just been a disturbed individual who'd made terrible decisions in moments of psychological crisis. She'd been operating as a research and development specialist for a criminal organization, using her pharmaceutical credentials to gain access to hospitals and families. The families upstairs, Agent Martinez continued, they've been living with guilt and unanswered questions for months or years. They blamed themselves for their children's deaths, wondered if they could have done something differently, never knowing that their babies were murdered by someone who specifically targeted them because of their vulnerabilities. She pulled out a list of names and locations that made the scope of Patricia's crimes clear. Rebecca Martinez in Jacksonville, whose son died at 4 months while her husband was deployed with the Marines. Linda Chen in Virginia Beach, whose daughter died at 7 months during her husband's submarine deployment. Patricia volunteered at the family support centers on both bases, specifically seeking out mothers who were struggling with the isolation of military life. Each name represented a family destroyed by Patricia's calculated cruelty, parents who'd carried undeserved guilt for tragedies they couldn't have prevented. They want to meet you because you represent something they thought was impossible, Agent Martinez said. You're proof that Patricia Thompson could be caught, that justice could be served, that their children's deaths weren't just random tragedies. We took the elevator to a larger conference room where several families were already waiting. The grief was immediately apparent in their careful postures, the hollow look in their eyes, that comes from loss too profound for complete healing. These were parents whose worlds had been shattered by Patricia's crimes, and they were looking at me with a mixture of gratitude and pain that I completely understood. Rebecca Martinez stood when we entered, a small woman in her late 20s, wearing a Marine Corps Wives Association pin on her jacket. You're Sarah, she said, her voice soft but steady. You're the one who survived. I'm so sorry, I said, the words feeling completely inadequate. I'm so sorry for what she did to your son, to all of your children. If I had known what she was capable of, if I had recognized the signs earlier. You couldn't have known, interrupted a man in army dress uniform, who I recognized as Staff Sergeant David Park. My daughter Amy died 8 months ago while I was deployed in Germany. My wife Jennifer is at home today because she couldn't bear to be in the same room with another baby who lived when ours died. The pain in his voice was so raw, it made my chest ache. Here was another military family, another deployed father who'd trusted that his wife and child would be safe while he served his country, only to return home to a funeral, and questions that nobody could answer until now. Patricia volunteered at our family readiness group, he continued. She said she understood how difficult deployment life could be, that she wanted to help military spouses cope with the stress and isolation. Jennifer was struggling with postpartum depression, and Patricia seemed like an answer to prayer. Another parent spoke up, a woman with prematurely gray hair, who clutched a small photograph against her chest. I'm Michelle Rodriguez. My son Carlos died 6 months ago in San Antonio. Patricia approached me at a new mother's support group, said she'd noticed how tired I looked and wanted to help. She brought formula supplements that she claimed would help with his colic. The stories continued, each one a variation on the same horrific theme. Patricia had perfected her hunting technique over years of practice, identifying mothers who were isolated, overwhelmed, or vulnerable to offers of help from a professional woman who claimed to understand their struggles. She'd gained their trust through careful manipulation, provided solutions to problems she'd often helped create, then used that access to murder their children in ways that looked like natural deaths. The question we all have, said another father, his voice rough with barely contained emotion, is why. What did she gain from killing our babies? What possible motivation could justify destroying innocent lives? Agent Martinez opened another file, containing psychiatric evaluations and behavioral analysis reports. Dr. James Patterson is a forensic psychologist who's been studying Patricia's case since her arrest. His preliminary assessment indicates that she suffers from a complex psychological disorder, characterized by pathological need for control and validation, through causing others pain. She pulled out clinical reports written in the careful language that psychiatrists use when describing behaviors that defy normal human understanding. Patricia was diagnosed with infertility in her early 30s due to complications from an untreated infection. Rather than seek appropriate therapy or find healthy ways to cope with this loss, she developed an obsession with proving that other women didn't deserve the children they had. Dad stood up and walked to the window, his jaw tight with controlled anger. So she appointed herself judge and executioner of other people's families. More than that, Agent Martinez replied. She convinced herself that she was conducting valuable research, that the information she gathered from these murders would somehow benefit medical science. In her mind, she wasn't committing crimes, she was advancing human knowledge through necessary sacrifices. The clinical explanation felt obscene when applied to the murder of innocent children. Patricia had created an elaborate justification system that allowed her to see herself as a researcher rather than a killer, a scientist gathering data rather than a monster destroying families. She kept detailed journals documenting each case. Agent Martinez continued, pulling out evidence bags containing notebooks written in Patricia's neat handwriting. She analyzed the families' reactions to their children's deaths, documented their descent into grief and self-blame, made notes about which approaches were most effective at avoiding detection. Rebecca Martinez made a sound like a wounded animal, and I reached out instinctively to comfort her. She looked at my hand on her arm, then at Emma sleeping peacefully in her car seat, and her expression crumbled completely. "Does it make you angry?" she asked through tears. "Knowing that your baby lived when ours died. Knowing that she gets to grow up and take first steps and say first words, while our children are buried in graves they should never have needed." The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. I thought about Emma's recent milestones, the way she'd started trying to pull herself up to standing, the babbling that was beginning to sound almost like words. All the developments that Carlos and Amy and the other children would never experience, because Patricia had decided their mothers needed to be punished. "It makes me grateful," I said finally. Grateful and guilty, and absolutely determined to make sure she never has the chance to hurt another family. She tried to take Emma away from me, and when that failed, she lost everything. Her freedom, her reputation, her ability to harm anyone else. Staff Sergeant Park leaned forward, his expression intense. "What we need to understand is how extensive this conspiracy really was." Agent Martinez mentioned a criminal network, but what exactly does that mean? Agent Martinez pulled out a map, showing connections between various organizations across multiple countries. The toxins Patricia used came from a sophisticated operation that supplies untraceable poisons to people who want to commit murder without getting caught. We're talking about a network that's been operating for over a decade, with clients ranging from domestic abusers to professional assassins. She pointed to different locations marked on the map. Patricia wasn't just a customer of this network, she was actively involved in product development and quality control. The detailed information she gathered about how these compounds affected children, which dosages were most effective, how to avoid detection by medical professionals. All of that data was being used to refine products that other killers could purchase. The scope of it was almost incomprehensible. Patricia hadn't just murdered children to satisfy her own
psychological needs, she'd been using their deaths to help other murderers become more efficient and harder to catch. How many other people has this network helped? Michelle Rodriguez asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're still investigating, but conservatively, we're looking at hundreds of murders over the past decade, possibly more than 1,000, Agent Martinez replied. "Your children's deaths, as horrific as they were, have given us the key to dismantling an entire industry of murder for hire." Dad turned back from the window, his expression carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades protecting American families from various threats. "What's the timeline for bringing down this entire operation?" "We've already arrested 47 people in 9 countries, Agent Martinez said. "We've seized laboratories, distribution networks, financial records, and enough illegal compounds to poison a small city. The intelligence Patricia provided about her victims has allowed us to connect dozens of unsolved deaths to products that came from this network." She closed the file and looked at each family in turn. "But there's something else you need to understand. The people Patricia was working with don't simply accept defeat when their operations get exposed. They fight back, and they often target the families who helped law enforcement build cases against them." The room went quiet as the implications settled over everyone. We'd helped expose a criminal conspiracy that operated internationally, and the people involved had both the motivation and resources to retaliate against witnesses and their families. "What does that mean for our safety?" Rebecca Martinez asked.
It means that everyone in this room, but especially Sarah's family, will remain under federal protection until we're confident that the entire network has been neutralized, Agent Martinez replied. General Mitchell's resources and security clearance provide some protection, but we're not taking any chances with anyone's safety. Emma woke up and started making the soft sounds that meant she was getting hungry. I lifted her from her car seat and held her against my chest, feeling her immediately relax into the familiar comfort of my arms. She looked up at me with those serious blue eyes, completely trusting that I would keep her safe from dangers she couldn't even imagine. There's something else we need to discuss, Agent Martinez said, pulling out additional documents. The trial strategy and what we'll need from each family to ensure that Patricia faces appropriate consequences for her crimes. She handed out packets of information containing legal procedures, victim impact statements, and trial timelines. Patricia's defense team is going to argue that she suffers from severe mental illness, that she wasn't responsible for her actions due to psychological impairment. They'll try to paint her as someone who deserves treatment rather than punishment. Dad's expression hardened at the suggestion that Patricia might avoid full accountability for her crimes. What evidence do they have for mental illness claims? They'll point to her history of depression following her infertility diagnosis, her obsessive behaviors, her elaborate justification systems for the murders, Agent Martinez replied. But we have her detailed journals, her careful planning, her systematic approach to victim selection and evidence disposal. This wasn't the behavior of someone who'd lost touch with reality. She opened one of the evidence bags and showed us pages from Patricia's notebooks, written in neat handwriting that documented her crimes with scientific precision. She wrote about each family like they were research subjects, analyzing their psychological vulnerabilities, documenting their reactions to grief, planning improvements for future attacks. These aren't the records of someone who was mentally incompetent. Staff Sergeant Park studied the journal pages with the focused attention of someone who'd been trained to analyze intelligence reports. This looks like operational planning, not the ramblings of someone having a psychological breakdown. Exactly, Agent Martinez confirmed. Patricia knew exactly what she was doing at every stage of these crimes. She researched her victims, planned their children's murders, executed those plans with careful attention to avoiding detection, and documented the results for future reference. That's not mental illness, that's criminal professionalism. The legal briefing continued for another hour, covering courtroom procedures, witness protection protocols, and the federal charges that Patricia would face. By the time we prepared to leave, it was clear that the upcoming trial would be one of the most significant criminal cases in recent federal court history. As we gathered our belongings, Rebecca Martinez approached me one final time. "I want you to know that I don't blame you for surviving when my son didn't," she said quietly. "But I need you to promise me something." "Anything," I replied, meaning it completely. "Promise me that you'll make sure Emma knows how fortunate she is. Promise me that you'll never take a single day with her for granted, because there are 11 mothers who would give anything to have one more day with their babies." I looked down at Emma, who was beginning to fall asleep again in my arms, her breathing steady and strong and completely normal. "I promise," I said, understanding that this commitment would shape how I approached every moment of motherhood for the rest of my life. As we drove home through the North Carolina countryside, Dad and I were both quiet, processing everything we'd learned about the scope of Patricia's crimes and the criminal network she'd been part of. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the pine forests that lined the highway, and I found myself thinking about how normal everything looked when viewed from outside our crisis. "Do you think she'll be convicted?" I asked finally. Dad was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the strategic mindset that had made him successful in military intelligence. "I think the evidence is overwhelming," he said finally. "But I also think her defense team is going to fight hard, and juries can sometimes be unpredictable when mental health issues are involved. So what do? We make sure every family affected by her crimes has a voice at trial," he replied. "We document every detail of her planning and preparation. We show the jury that Patricia Thompson is exactly what the evidence proves her to be, a calculating killer who used her professional credentials to murder children for profit and psychological satisfaction." He reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "And then we go home, we raise Emma, and we build the life that Patricia tried to destroy." As we pulled into our driveway in Pine Valley Estates, I could see Mrs. Chen working in her garden, probably wondering about all the federal vehicles that had been parked in our neighborhood for the past few days. The normalcy of suburban life felt almost surreal after everything we'd learned about Patricia's criminal activities. Emma was still sleeping peacefully in her car seat, completely oblivious to the fact that her survival had exposed a network of killers and saved countless other families from experiencing what we'd been through. Tomorrow she would wake up and smile, and continue developing into the person she was meant to become, carrying forward the best parts of our family while leaving behind the darkness that had tried to claim her. That night, after Emma was asleep in her crib and Dad had settled into the guest room, I sat on our back porch and called Jake using the satellite phone that his unit had provided for family emergencies. The connection was scratchy, but hearing his voice made everything feel more manageable. "I'm coming home as soon as the Army can arrange transport," he said. "Emergency leave has been approved, and I should be there within 48 hours. "I can't wait to see you," I replied. "Emma's going to be so excited to see her daddy." "How are you holding up?" he asked, and I could hear the worry in his voice despite the static. "Better now that we know the truth," I said. "It's still hard to believe that your mother was capable of something like this, but at least we know it wasn't our fault, and we know she'll never be able to hurt anyone else." The line was quiet for a moment before Jake spoke again. "I keep thinking about all the times she criticized your parenting, all the comments about how you weren't experienced enough or qualified enough to take care of Emma. She was setting you up, wasn't she? Making you doubt yourself so you'd be more likely to accept her help." That realization hit me like a physical blow. Patricia's months of subtle undermining, her constant suggestions that I wasn't capable of caring for Emma properly, her implications that my nursing background wasn't sufficient preparation for motherhood, it had all been psychological preparation for the moment when she would offer her poisonous solution to problems she'd helped create. "She played a very long game," I said, "but she made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" "She underestimated who she was really dealing with. She thought I was just another isolated military wife with no resources and no powerful connections. She had no idea that attacking your daughter meant declaring war on a 4-star general." Above us, the Carolina stars were beginning to appear in the clear winter sky, the same constellations that had guided travelers and families for thousands of years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as the federal investigation continued and the legal proceedings began. But tonight, Emma was safe in her crib, Jake was coming home, and Patricia Thompson was sitting in a federal holding cell facing charges that would keep her locked away for the rest of her life. The war she'd started by trying to poison my daughter was about to end in her complete and total defeat. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse in Raleigh, wearing the same navy dress I'd worn to Emma's christening, holding my now 1-year-old daughter against my chest as Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez delivered his closing arguments to the jury. Emma had grown so much since that terrible night when Patricia tried to kill her. She could walk now, babble in complex patterns that almost sounded like conversation, and had developed the kind of infectious giggle that made strangers smile when we went grocery shopping. The courtroom was packed with families whose lives had been destroyed by Patricia's systematic murder campaign. Rebecca Martinez sat in the front row, clutching her son's baby blanket, while Staff Sergeant Park held his wife Jennifer's hand as she quietly wept for their daughter Amy. 11 families who'd finally learned the truth about how their children died, 11 mothers who'd carried undeserved guilt for months or years, all waiting to hear whether justice would finally be served. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Attorney Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of irrefutable evidence, "the defendant kept meticulous records documenting her crimes. She researched potential victims with the precision of a military operation, planned their children's murders with scientific methodology, and celebrated when those plans succeeded. This was not the behavior of someone suffering from mental illness. This was the calculated behavior of a predator who used her pharmaceutical credentials to gain access to vulnerable families." I glanced over at the defense table where Patricia sat between her attorneys, wearing a conservative gray suit and an expression of manufactured remorse that I now recognized as completely fraudulent. She'd lost considerable weight during her months in federal custody, and her once perfect hair was pulled back in a simple style that made her appear younger and more sympathetic. Everything about her appearance had been carefully calculated to support her defense team's narrative of a troubled woman who'd suffered a psychological breakdown. But I knew better now. I'd read her journals, seen the evidence of years of planning and preparation, understood the systematic nature of her crimes. Patricia hadn't snapped or lost control of her mental faculties. She'd found her calling in causing other people unimaginable pain, and she'd pursued it with the same professional dedication she'd brought to her pharmaceutical career. The trial had lasted 4 weeks, with federal prosecutors methodically presenting evidence that connected Patricia to each murder. Financial records showing her cryptocurrency purchases of illegal compounds from international criminal networks. Travel documentation placing her in the vicinity of each victim when they died. Hospital security footage showing her volunteering in pediatric units where she had no legitimate business. Text messages to associates expressing satisfaction when she learned about children dying under mysterious circumstances. The defense had attempted every possible strategy, arguing that she was mentally incompetent, that the evidence was circumstantial, that correlation didn't prove causation beyond reasonable doubt. They'd brought in psychiatrists who testified about her history of depression and anxiety following her infertility diagnosis. They'd painted a picture of a woman driven to desperate acts by grief and psychological instability that had been building for years. But they couldn't explain away the journals, page after page of careful planning, victim selection criteria, detailed notes about dosages and expected outcomes, post-mortem analysis of each family's reaction to their loss. Patricia had written about the murders like a researcher documenting experiments, analyzing what techniques worked most effectively and planning improvements for future attacks. The defendant's own words condemn her. Attorney Rodriguez continued, holding up one of the journals that had become central evidence in the prosecution's case. She wrote, and I quote, "Subject identification must prioritize psychological vulnerability over geographical convenience. Isolated mothers with limited support networks provide optimal conditions for maximum guilt and self-recrimination following intervention." These are not the words of someone who had lost touch with reality. These are the words of a predator who understood exactly what she was doing and why. Emma stirred in my arms, making the soft cooing sounds that had become my favorite music over the past year. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in that unique toddler smell that was part shampoo, part snack crackers, part pure innocence. She would never remember the night her grandmother tried to kill her, would never know how close she'd come to becoming another entry in Patricia's journal of murdered children. Jake sat beside me in his dress uniform, having been granted extended leave to attend the trial and provide support during what the Army had classified as a family crisis requiring ongoing military assistance. He'd been promoted to major following his emergency deployment return, partly in recognition of his exemplary service record, but also because the Army understood that families of senior military officials required additional security considerations. The defense attorney, Linda Hayes, stood for her closing argument with the kind of polished confidence that comes from expensive legal training and years of courtroom experience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client is not the calculating monster the prosecution has painted her to be. She is a deeply troubled woman who suffered years of psychological trauma after learning she could never have biological children of her own. I wanted to stand up and scream that it was all lies, that Patricia had been cold and calculating, and fully aware of her actions throughout every murder she'd planned and executed. But Dad's hand on my shoulder reminded me to stay calm, to trust that the evidence would speak for itself. Yes, Patricia Thompson made terrible mistakes," Hayes continued. "Yes, innocent children died because of her actions. But intent matters in our legal system. Mental capacity matters. And the evidence shows that Patricia Thompson was not capable of forming the specific intent required for first-degree murder charges." The jury deliberated for 26 hours across 4 days, during which I spent most of my time in a small conference room down the hall from the courtroom, nursing Emma and trying not to think about what would happen if they found Patricia not guilty by reason of insanity. The other families were struggling with the same fears, that years of seeking justice would end with the woman who'd murdered their children being sent to a psychiatric facility where she might eventually be released. Dad had arranged for additional security during the deliberation period, because Agent Martinez had received intelligence suggesting that associates of Patricia's criminal network might attempt to interfere with the trial proceedings. Federal marshals were stationed throughout the courthouse, and our family remained under protective surveillance that would continue regardless of the trial's outcome. On the 4th day, the jury foreman sent word that they'd reached a verdict on all counts. The bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom, and I felt my heart pounding against my ribs as we took our seats. Emma sensed my tension and started fussing, so I bounced her gently while trying to read the jurors' faces for any hint of what they'd decided. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Michael Chen, the foreman read, his voice steady and clear, we find the defendant guilty. Rebecca Martinez let out a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, and I reached over to squeeze her shoulder as the foreman continued reading through all 11 murder charges. One by one he delivered guilty verdicts that sent waves of relief and vindication through the families who'd waited so long for this moment. On the charge of attempted murder of Emma Thompson, he continued, and my vision blurred with tears as he pronounced the words I'd been praying to hear for months, we find the defendant guilty. Patricia's reaction was immediate and revealing. Instead of the devastated collapse you might expect from someone who'd been suffering from mental illness, she straightened in her chair and looked directly at me with pure undiluted hatred. For just a moment the mask of manufactured remorse slipped completely, and everyone in that courtroom could see exactly what she really was, a calculating killer who'd been caught, and was furious about facing consequences. This isn't over, she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom with chilling clarity. You think you've accomplished something but you have no idea what you've started. There are people who won't forget what you've done. The bailiff quickly moved to silence her, but her words hung in the air like a threat that would be fulfilled someday. Even from prison, Patricia was making it clear that she had connections to dangerous people who might seek revenge against the families who'd helped convict her. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them, then scheduled sentencing for the following week. As court officers led Patricia away in shackles, she turned back one final time to look at the families whose lives she'd destroyed, her expression promising that this legal defeat was just the beginning of a longer conflict. Agent Martinez appeared at my elbow as we prepared to leave the courthouse. We need to talk, she said quietly. There have been developments in the broader investigation that affect your family's long-term security. She led us to a secure conference room in the federal building across the street, where she opened files containing intelligence reports that I'd never seen before. During the trial, we continued investigating the criminal network that supplied Patricia with the compounds she used to murder the children. What we've discovered is that her conviction has triggered responses from criminal organizations in multiple countries. She pulled out surveillance photographs showing people who looked like they'd stepped out of spy movies, professional criminals with the kind of alert, dangerous expressions that suggested they were comfortable with violence. The network Patricia was working with has been providing untraceable poisons to killers for over 15 years. We're talking about an organization that's facilitated thousands of murders worldwide, and they don't appreciate losing their research and development specialist. Dad leaned forward, his expression shifting into the focused intensity he used when dealing with national security threats. Are you saying they're planning retaliation against our family? We've intercepted communications suggesting that they view your family as responsible for dismantling their entire North American operation, Agent Martinez replied. Patricia's detailed records didn't just help us convict her, they gave us access to client lists, distribution networks, financial structures, and operational procedures that we've used to arrest people in 17 countries. She showed us a map displaying the scope of the international arrests that had resulted from Patricia's conviction. Red pins marked locations where criminal associates had been captured, while yellow pins showed facilities that had been raided and shut down. The scale was enormous, an entire industry of murder for hire that had been operating undetected for over a decade. The intelligence Patricia provided about her victims, her documentation of how the compounds worked, her analysis of detection methods, it was all being used to refine products that other killers could purchase. Agent Martinez continued. Her journals weren't just records of her own crimes. They were research data for an international conspiracy that enabled countless murders. Emma had fallen asleep in my arms, completely oblivious to the discussion about ongoing threats to our safety. She looked so peaceful, so perfectly normal, that it was hard to believe her survival had set in motion events that were still unfolding across multiple continents. What does this mean for our family? Jake asked, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that came from years of military training and threat assessment. It means you'll remain under federal protection indefinitely, Agent Martinez replied. The people Patricia was working with have both the motivation and resources to target families who helped expose their operations. General Mitchell's position provides some security advantages, but we're not taking any chances with anyone's safety. She handed us updated security protocols, new contact procedures, and emergency response plans that would govern our daily lives for the foreseeable future. Our quiet suburban existence in Pine Valley Estates was permanently changed, surrounded by protective surveillance and constant awareness of people who had nothing left to lose. There's something else you need to understand, Agent Martinez said, her expression becoming even more serious. The sentencing hearing next week isn't just about Patricia Thompson anymore. It's about sending a message to criminal organizations worldwide that the United States will use unlimited resources to protect American families from this kind of terrorism. The word terrorism hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of Patricia's crimes as serial murder, as the actions of a disturbed individual who'd caused unimaginable harm to innocent families. But Agent Martinez was describing something much larger, an attack on American military families that had been coordinated with international criminal networks. Is that what this really was? I asked. Terrorism. Patricia specifically targeted military wives whose husbands were deployed in combat zones, Agent Martinez replied. She used their vulnerabilities against them, murdered their children to cause maximum psychological damage, and provided intelligence about American military families to criminal organizations that operate in countries where our forces are engaged. By any reasonable definition, that's terrorism. Dad stood up and walked to the window, looking out at downtown Raleigh, with the expression he wore when processing complex strategic threats. What you're describing isn't just criminal conspiracy. It's warfare conducted against American families by people who want to undermine our military effectiveness. Exactly, Agent Martinez confirmed. And Patricia's conviction has given us the opportunity to strike back at the entire network. In the past 6 months, we've dismantled criminal organizations that have been operating since the 1990s. We've prevented what we estimate would have been hundreds of additional murders. We've sent a clear message that attacks on American families will be met with overwhelming force. The sentencing hearing the following week was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The federal courthouse was surrounded by security personnel from multiple agencies, with bomb-sniffing dogs and metal detectors screening everyone who entered the building. Media representatives from around the world had gathered to cover what legal experts were calling one of the most significant terrorism prosecutions in recent history. Judge Elizabeth Morrison presided over the proceedings with the kind of stern dignity that comes from years of handling federal criminal cases. She'd reviewed all the evidence, read every victim impact statement, and studied the psychiatric evaluations that both sides had submitted regarding Patricia's mental state. Mrs. Thompson, she said, looking directly at Patricia with an expression of absolute disgust, you have been convicted of 11 counts of first-degree murder, and 1 count of attempted murder. You have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit terrorism, international racketeering, and numerous other federal crimes that carry mandatory life sentences. Patricia stood between her attorneys, no longer bothering to maintain the facade of remorse that she'd worn throughout the trial. Her true nature was finally visible, cold, calculating, completely unrepentant about the destruction she'd caused. Before I impose sentence, Judge Morrison continued, I want you to understand the full scope of what you've done. You didn't just murder children, Mrs. Thompson. You declared war on American families. You targeted the wives and children of military personnel who were serving their country in dangerous locations. You used their patriotic sacrifice against them in the most evil way imaginable. She pulled out a thick folder containing victim impact statements from every family Patricia had destroyed. 11 children are dead because of your actions. 11 sets of parents have endured grief that no human being should ever experience. Countless other families live in fear because they know that people like you exist in the world. The judge's voice grew stronger as she continued, but you made one crucial error in your calculations, Mrs. Thompson. You attacked the granddaughter of a 4-star general, and you discovered that some enemies are too powerful to defeat. Your conviction has led to the dismantling of international criminal networks, the arrest of hundreds of killers, and the prevention of countless future murders. She looked at each family in the courtroom, her expression softening slightly as she acknowledged their presence. These families have shown remarkable courage in helping law enforcement build the case against you. Their cooperation has saved lives around the world. Then her attention returned to Patricia, and her voice carried the full weight of federal judicial authority. Patricia Thompson, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each count of murder, to be served consecutively. I sentence you to life imprisonment on the terrorism charges, also to be served consecutively. You will never again breathe free air, and you will never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs and whispered prayers, as family members finally heard the words they'd been waiting for since their children died. Patricia would spend the rest of her life in a federal supermax prison, isolated from other inmates, and under constant surveillance, to prevent her from continuing to coordinate with criminal associates. As court officers led her away for the final time, Patricia looked back at our family with an expression of pure malice. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," she said, her voice barely audible, but clearly intended as a final threat. "This will never truly be over." Agent Martinez was waiting for us outside the courtroom, with an update that both reassured and concerned me. 93 arrests in the past week, she said. Patricia's sentencing triggered a coordinated international operation that has essentially destroyed the criminal network she was part of. The threat level to your family has decreased significantly, but we're maintaining protective surveillance until we're absolutely certain that everyone involved has
been neutralized. 3 months after Patricia's sentencing, Jake received orders for a new assignment at Fort Bragg that would keep him stationed in North Carolina for the next 4 years. The Army's decision was partly coincidental, but also reflected their understanding that our family required stable assignment due to ongoing security considerations. We would remain in Pine Valley Estates, surrounded by the military community that had supported us throughout this crisis. Emma celebrated her second birthday that spring in our backyard, surrounded by neighbors who'd become like extended family during the darkest period of our lives. Mrs. Chen brought homemade cupcakes and helped organize games for the toddlers who ran around our yard with the kind of careless joy that children bring to every celebration. As I watched Emma chase bubbles across the grass, laughing with pure delight at simple pleasures, I thought about the letter I'd received from Rebecca Martinez the week before. She'd written to tell me that she was pregnant again, that she and her husband had decided to try for another child despite the fear that would always be part of their parenting experience. "I'm not saying I'm completely healed," she'd written. "Michael will always be missing from our family, and nothing can change that, but knowing the truth about how he died, knowing that his killer faced justice, it's given me permission to hope again, to believe that love is stronger than the evil that tried to destroy us." She'd ended the letter with a request that had become familiar from other families affected by Patricia's crimes. "Please keep sending pictures of Emma as she grows up. I want to see her graduate from kindergarten, learn to ride a bicycle, all the milestones that Michael will never reach." It might sound strange, but watching her thrive helps me remember that life continues despite the people who try to stop it. That evening, after the birthday party had ended and Emma was asleep in her bed, Jake and I sat on our back porch and watched the Carolina stars appear in the clear spring sky. The Federal Protection Detail was still maintaining surveillance from unmarked vehicles, but their presence had become as normal as any other aspect of our neighborhood routine. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd given Emma the full dose Patricia recommended?" Jake asked quietly. I thought about it, imagining a world where Emma hadn't survived, where I'd become another grieving mother in Agent Martinez's case files, where Patricia's crimes might never have been discovered. "I try not to think about it," I said. "But when I do, I remember something my father taught me about military strategy. Sometimes the best defense is being too strong for your enemies to defeat." Jake took my hand, his thumb tracing the wedding ring that had survived everything Patricia tried to destroy. She thought she was attacking an isolated military wife with no resources and no powerful connections. She had no idea that she was declaring war on a 4-star general's family. Above us, the stars continued their ancient patterns, the same constellations that had guided families and travelers for thousands of years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Emma continued growing and the world continued changing around us. But tonight we were together and safe and grateful for the miracle of ordinary life continuing after extraordinary evil had tried to stop it. In the distance, I could hear the gentle sound of Mrs. Chen's wind chimes playing their quiet music in the evening breeze, mixing with the soft whisper of Emma's breathing through the baby monitor. It was a symphony of peace that Patricia had tried to silence forever, but she'd failed completely. Love had won, justice had been served. And tomorrow, Emma would wake up and smile and continue growing into the person she was meant to become, carrying forward the best parts of our family while leaving behind the darkness that had tried to claim her. That was victory enough for any mother's heart. 2 years after Patricia's conviction, I was pushing Emma on the swing set in our backyard when Agent Martinez called with news that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the phone. The international task force investigating Patricia's criminal network had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reached far deeper than anyone had initially imagined. What we'd thought was the end of a nightmare was actually just the beginning of understanding how extensive the threat to American military families really was. "We need you at the Pentagon tomorrow morning," Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard since the early days of the investigation.
There are developments that require briefing at the highest levels of national security, and your father has requested that you be present for the intelligence presentation. Emma laughed with pure joy as the swing carried her higher, her blonde curls streaming behind her in the afternoon breeze. At 3 years old, she was fearless and curious about everything, completely unaware that her survival had exposed a network of international criminals who'd been targeting American military families for over 2 decades. She would start preschool in the fall, excited about meeting new friends and learning to write her name, living the normal childhood that Patricia had tried to steal from her. Jake was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I hung up the phone, and I could see through the window that he'd already begun setting the table for our evening meal. His promotion to lieutenant colonel had come with additional responsibilities at Fort Bragg, but he'd made it clear to his commanding officers that family security remained his top priority until all threats related to Patricia's network had been completely neutralized. What did Agent Martinez want? He asked when I came inside with Emma, who immediately ran to her toy box to retrieve the stuffed elephant that had become her constant companion. Pentagon briefing tomorrow morning, I said, keeping my voice neutral so Emma wouldn't pick up on any anxiety. Something about new developments in the international investigation. Jake's expression grew serious as he processed the implications. Pentagon briefings weren't routine updates, they were reserved for intelligence that affected national security at the highest levels. Whatever Agent Martinez and the task force had discovered, it was significant enough to require direct briefing to senior military leadership. That evening, after Emma was asleep in her bed surrounded by the night light projections that cast dancing butterflies across her ceiling, Jake and I sat in our living room and tried to prepare ourselves for whatever we might learn the next day. The Federal Protection Detail had been scaled back over the past year as immediate threats diminished, but unmarked vehicles still made regular patrols through Pine Valley estates, and our security system remained connected to military police monitoring stations. "Do you think they've found more victims?" Jake asked, his voice quiet in the lamplight. "I don't know," I replied honestly. But Agent Martinez sounded like this was bigger than additional murder cases. She mentioned intelligence that affects national security, not just criminal prosecution. The drive to Washington the next morning was conducted in a government sedan with security escorts, through routes that had been carefully planned to avoid potential surveillance or interception. Dad met us at the Pentagon's secured entrance, wearing his dress uniform with the 4 stars that commanded immediate respect from everyone we encountered. "Before we go into the briefing," he said, guiding us through corridors that required multiple security clearances, "I need you to understand that what you're about to hear is classified at levels that most government officials never access. This information cannot be shared with anyone outside this building, and it will change how you understand everything that's happened to our family." The briefing room was filled with senior military officers, FBI directors, CIA analysts, and international intelligence coordinators representing agencies I'd never heard of. Everyone stood when Dad entered, a mark of respect for his rank and his role in exposing the criminal network that had threatened American military families worldwide. Director James Patterson of the FBI's International Terrorism Division opened the presentation with information that made my blood run cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, the investigation initiated by General Mitchell's family has uncovered evidence of a coordinated attack on American military readiness that has been ongoing for over 20 years. He activated a massive display screen showing connections between criminal organizations across multiple continents, with lines indicating communication networks, financial transfers, and operational coordination that painted a picture of systematic warfare against American families. Patricia Thompson wasn't just a serial killer working with a criminal network," Director Patterson continued. "She was an operative in a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to undermine American military effectiveness by targeting the families of deployed personnel." The room fell completely silent as the implications of his words settled over everyone present. Patricia hadn't been motivated by personal psychological issues or criminal profit. She'd been conducting warfare against the United States by attacking the most vulnerable members of military families. Agent Martinez stepped forward to present the detailed intelligence that her task force had assembled over the past 2 years. The compounds Patricia used to poison children were developed specifically to cause deaths that would appear natural, avoiding detection while maximizing psychological damage to military personnel. She displayed chemical analysis reports showing the sophisticated nature of the toxins Patricia had obtained. These weren't black market drugs or improvised poisons. They were precision-engineered weapons designed by state-sponsored laboratories to cause specific types of neurological damage in developing brains. Dad leaned forward, his expression shifting into the focused intensity he used when analyzing strategic threats. Which countries are involved in this operation? That's where this gets complicated, Agent Martinez replied, pulling up satellite images of facilities in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. The laboratory work was conducted in countries that maintain plausible deniability about their involvement, but the operational planning and target selection were coordinated through networks that trace back to nations that consider themselves strategic competitors of the United States. She showed us surveillance footage of meetings between individuals who looked like they'd stepped out of spy novels, professional intelligence operatives discussing American military families like they were legitimate targets in an undeclared war. Patricia Thompson was recruited during a pharmaceutical conference in Prague 8 years ago, Agent Martinez continued. Her infertility diagnosis and resulting psychological vulnerabilities made her an ideal candidate for an operation that required someone willing to harm children to advance strategic objectives. The systematic nature of Patricia's recruitment and training was staggering. She hadn't simply stumbled into criminal activity or been corrupted by exposure to dangerous people. She'd been deliberately identified, assessed and developed as an intelligence asset whose mission was to damage American military morale by attacking families. The target selection criteria we found in her journals weren't just her personal preferences, Agent Martinez explained. They were operational parameters provided by her handlers, designed to identify military families whose destruction would have maximum impact on unit effectiveness and deployment readiness. CIA Director Sarah Chen presented intelligence about the broader scope of the operation that made Emma's poisoning seem like just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. We've identified similar operations targeting military families in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and other NATO allies. This wasn't just an attack on American families, it was a coordinated assault on Western military alliance structures. She displayed charts showing correlations between unexplained child deaths in military families and subsequent decreases in deployment effectiveness, unit cohesion, and re-enlistment rates among affected personnel. The people behind this operation understood that destroying families was more effective than direct military confrontation in undermining our defense capabilities. Dad stood up and walked to the display screen, studying the connections between various criminal organizations and state-sponsored intelligence agencies. What you're describing is a form of warfare that specifically targets non-combatants to achieve strategic military objectives. Exactly, Director Chen confirmed. And Patricia Thompson's conviction has given us the opportunity to expose and dismantle the entire network before it could achieve its ultimate objectives. Agent Martinez pulled up arrest records showing the scope of the international response that had followed Patricia's trial. In the past 18 months, we've arrested 417 people in 23 countries. We've shut down laboratories, distribution networks, financial systems, and communication channels that have been operating undetected for decades. The scale of the operation was almost incomprehensible. What had started with my desperate phone call to Dad during Emma's medical crisis had evolved into one of the largest counterintelligence operations in American history, involving agencies and resources that most people never knew existed. The intelligence Patricia provided about her victims, her documentation of attack methods, her communication records with handlers, all of that information has allowed us to identify and neutralize threats that we never knew we were facing. Agent Martinez continued. She showed us photographs of families whose children had died under circumstances similar to Emma's poisoning, cases that had been classified as SIDS or unexplained medical emergencies until Patricia's journals provided the missing connections. 37 additional families have learned that their children were murdered as part of this intelligence operation, she said. 37 sets of parents who blamed themselves for tragedies they couldn't have prevented, who carried guilt for deaths that were actually acts of war against American military families. The briefing continued for 3 hours, covering operational details, international legal proceedings, and ongoing security measures that would affect our family for years to come. By the time Director Patterson concluded the presentation, it was clear that Emma's survival had prevented not just her death, but the continuation of a systematic attack on American military readiness. The operation Patricia was part of had specific targets for the next phase, he explained. Families of pilots involved in strategic aircraft programs, spouses of submarine commanders, children of special operations personnel. If we hadn't stopped them when we did, the damage to our military effectiveness could have been catastrophic. As we prepared to leave the Pentagon, Dad pulled me aside for a private conversation that would change how I understood everything our family had experienced. "Sarah, there's something else you need to know," he said, his voice carrying the weight of classified information that he'd been authorized to share. "Emma wasn't randomly selected as Patricia's target. Your family was specifically chosen because of my position and security clearance." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of Patricia's attack as personal revenge motivated by jealousy and psychological disorders. But Dad was telling me that Emma had been targeted because attacking a four-star general's granddaughter would have maximum strategic impact. They wanted to demonstrate that no American military family was safe from their reach, he continued. If they could successfully murder the granddaughter of someone at my level without detection, it would send a message that would undermine confidence throughout the entire military command structure. I thought about Emma playing on her swing set that morning, laughing with the kind of innocent joy that children bring to simple pleasures, completely unaware that enemy intelligence agencies had planned her death to advance strategic objectives against the United States. But they made one crucial miscalculation, Dad said, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who turned an enemy's strength against them. They assumed that attacking my family would demonstrate their power and our vulnerability. Instead, it exposed their entire operation and led to their complete destruction. The drive home from Washington was quiet, with all of us processing the magnitude of what we'd learned. Emma fell asleep in her car seat, exhausted from the long day and completely oblivious to the fact that international intelligence agencies had considered her death a strategic military objective. That evening, after Emma was in bed and Jake was reviewing security updates from his Fort Bragg contacts, I sat on our back porch and called Rebecca Martinez to share what I could about the day's revelations. She'd become more than just another victim's mother over the past 2 years. She'd become a close friend, whose strength and resilience inspired me constantly. "I can't tell you the details," I said, "but I wanted you to know that Michael's death was part of something much bigger than we ever imagined. He didn't die because Patricia was a disturbed individual, making terrible choices. He died because enemy agents targeted him as part of an attack on American military families." The line was quiet for a long moment before Rebecca spoke. "Does that make it better or worse?" she asked, "knowing that my son was killed by foreign enemies instead of just a crazy woman?" I thought about her question, considering how this new information changed my understanding of Emma's poisoning and the deaths of the other children. "I think it makes it clearer," I said finally. "Michael didn't die because you did something wrong, or because you trusted the wrong person. He died because he was an American military family member, and there are people in the world who saw that as reason enough to murder him." "But those people have been stopped now?" she asked. "Completely stopped," I confirmed. "The entire network has been destroyed, and the countries behind it know that we're watching for any attempt to rebuild similar operations." A year later, Emma started kindergarten at the elementary school on Fort Bragg, joining a class of military children whose families understood the unique challenges and rewards of growing up in the Army community. She was excited about learning to read, making new friends, and participating in the school's science fair, where she planned to demonstrate how butterflies develop from caterpillars. The teachers at her school had been briefed about our family's security requirements, though they understood only that we'd been victims of a serious crime that required ongoing protective measures. Emma's classroom had additional security cameras, and federal agents maintained discreet surveillance during school hours. But to her classmates, she was just another Army kid whose daddy wore a uniform to work. Jake received orders for a new assignment at the Pentagon that fall, a promotion to full colonel that came with responsibilities for coordinating family security programs across all military branches. His new position was partly a result of his exemplary service record, but also reflected the Army's recognition that our family's experience had exposed vulnerabilities in how the military protected dependents from sophisticated threats. "We're going to make sure no other family goes through what we experienced," he told me as we packed our belongings for the move to the Washington area. "The security protocols we developed, the intelligence networks we built, the international cooperation we established, all of that is going to become standard protection for military families worldwide." On our last evening in Pine Valley Estates, Mrs. Chen came over with a farewell dinner and photo albums, documenting Emma's growth from the sick infant who'd almost died to the healthy, happy child who was excited about starting first grade in Virginia. The pictures showed birthday parties, neighborhood barbecues, playground adventures, and countless ordinary moments that Patricia's enemies had tried to prevent. She's going to do remarkable things with her life, Mrs. Chen said, watching Emma organize her toys for the moving truck that would arrive the next morning. Children who survive something like this, they often grow up to be very special people. I looked at Emma, who was carefully packing her stuffed elephant, and explaining to it that they were going on an adventure to a new house with a bigger backyard. She had no memory of the night she almost died, no understanding of the international conspiracy that had targeted her, no awareness that her survival had changed the course of global intelligence operations. I hope she gets to have a completely normal childhood from now on, I said. No more federal agents, no more security briefings, no more reminders that there are people in the world who wanted to hurt her. Agent Martinez made one final visit before our move, bringing news that felt like the closing of a chapter that had defined our family's life for the past 3 years. The last of Patricia's handlers was arrested in Romania yesterday, she said. Every person involved in the operation that targeted your family has now been neutralized. She handed me a formal letter from the Department of Defense, signed by the Secretary himself, expressing gratitude for our family's cooperation and sacrifice in exposing threats to American military families worldwide. Because of your courage and your father's resources, the letter read, an intelligence operation that had been targeting American families for over 2 decades has been completely dismantled. The lives saved by your family's actions cannot be calculated, but they number in the hundreds or possibly thousands. That night, as we put Emma to bed in her room surrounded by boxes and suitcases, she asked a question that showed how much she understood about the changes in our family's life. Mommy, why do we always have police cars near our house? She asked, her 3-year-old logic trying to make sense of the security measures that had been part of her environment since she was an infant. Because there are people whose job is to keep families safe, I said, choosing words that were true but age-appropriate. And sometimes families like ours need extra protection because we helped catch some bad people who were hurting others. Are the bad people gone now? She asked. Yes, sweetheart, the bad people are all gone now, and they can't hurt anyone else. She nodded with the satisfied acceptance that children bring to adult explanations, then asked her next question, will there be butterflies in our new backyard? I'm sure there will be, Jake said, joining us for Emma's bedtime routine. Butterflies live everywhere, and they're always looking for good families to visit. As we drove away from Pine Valley Estates the next morning, I looked back at the house where Emma had almost died, and where we'd learned that love really is stronger than the evil that tries to destroy families. Mrs. Chen was standing in her garden, waving goodbye and wiping tears from her eyes, surrounded by the flowers that had provided so much beauty during the darkest period of our lives. Our new home in Virginia was a fresh start in every way that mattered. Emma would attend a school where none of her classmates knew about her medical history, or her family's role in exposing international criminals. Jake would work at the Pentagon developing programs to protect other military families from the kinds of threats we'd faced. And I would return to nursing, using my experience to help families navigate medical crises with the strength that comes from surviving something unthinkable. 5 years after Patricia's conviction, Emma celebrated her 8th birthday with a party that included school friends who knew nothing about enemy agents or international conspiracies. She was learning to play piano, excelling in math, and showing signs of the kind of leadership abilities that often develop in children who've overcome early challenges. The thank you cards from other military families continued to arrive regularly. Parents whose children were alive because the security protocols developed after Emma's poisoning had prevented similar attacks. Rebecca Martinez sent updates about her 2 younger children, born after Michael's death, who were growing up in a world where the threats their older brother had faced no longer existed. I think about Michael every day, she wrote in her most recent letter. But I no longer think about what I could have done differently, because I know now that his death wasn't about my choices. It was about enemies who targeted him because he was an American military family member, and those enemies have been defeated. Dad retired from active duty that spring, choosing to end his military career on the victory that had dismantled an intelligence operation targeting American families. His final Pentagon briefing was attended by military leaders from NATO countries, who'd implemented similar family protection programs, based on the intelligence we'd helped provide. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers in combat zones, but by families in their own homes, he said during his retirement ceremony. My granddaughter's survival proved that American families are stronger than the enemies who try to destroy them. As I watched Emma chase butterflies across our backyard that afternoon, laughing with the pure joy that children bring to simple discoveries, I thought about how different our lives might have been if Patricia's plan had succeeded. Emma would never have learned to walk or talk or ask endless questions about how the world works. Jake and I would have become another military couple destroyed by grief, our marriage probably unable to survive the guilt and blame that Patricia's enemies had designed to tear families apart. Instead, Emma was growing up to be curious and confident and kind, carrying forward the best parts of our family while leaving behind the darkness that had tried to claim her. She would face normal childhood challenges, learning to ride a bicycle, making friends at school, deciding what she wanted to be when she grew up. But she would face them as a survivor, who'd already overcome more than most people experience in entire lifetimes. That evening, as Jake and I sat on our back porch watching the Virginia stars appear in the clear spring sky, we talked about the latest intelligence report confirming that no similar operations were targeting American military families anywhere in the world. "Do you think it's really over?" I asked. "I think we broke something that our enemies spent decades building," Jake replied. "And I think they learned that attacking American families brings consequences they can't survive." Emma appeared in the doorway, wearing her pajamas and carrying the stuffed elephant that had been her companion through everything we'd experienced. "Mommy, will you read me a story about butterflies?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, lifting her onto my lap and opening the book she'd chosen. As I read about metamorphosis and transformation, about creatures that emerge from darkness into beautiful flight, I realized that Emma's story had become a kind of metamorphosis too, from victim to survivor, to symbol of hope for families around the world. The war that Patricia and her handlers had started by trying to poison my daughter had ended in their complete defeat. Love had won, justice had been served. And tomorrow, Emma would wake up and smile, and continue growing into the remarkable person she was meant to become, proving every day that some things are too strong to be destroyed by the people who try to stop them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.